My world that I want to have a little pride in. My world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say I am what I am.
I'm joined down here, as you can see, in the palatial surroundings of Trinity College Dublin, and my guest today is Professor and Senator Ivana Bacik. So, Ivana, welcome to LGBTlife and welcome to Dublin City FM.
Thank you very much, Mike. Lovely to be here.
Yeah. Ivana, you're running for the Senate again. Now, one of the great mysteries in my household is how Ivana Bacik is a senator and not a TD. You must have thought about this yourself. I mean,
well, that's very kind. Thank you. I did run for the Dáil previously. Twice, but not this time round. So the last time I ran was 5 years ago in Dunleary. I came very close to getting elected. I think about 150 votes shy of a seat. But I suppose, you know, the reality was that I think unless you have an opportunity locally to run in your own area, people don't tend to like so much voting for somebody from outside the area. And certainly that's what we found in Dunleary, that although I've lots of connections to that area, it isn't where I live. Where I live is in Dublin Bay South, and there wasn't a place for me on a ticket for Labour in Dublin Bay South this time around, so I didn't run for the Dáil. I must say though, I feel like I have done an awful lot, been able to do a lot in the Seanad in the last 5 years, and would really welcome the opportunity to be able to do more in the Seanad in the next term. So I was very happy, I must say, not to run in the general election this time around and to focus on running again for the Seanad.
Yeah. I'll come back to the general election in a sec, but something we briefly alluded to before we came on the air. Would your chances have been better had you have been called, say, Joan Bailey? I mean, it's fascinating when I come across this, is that whenever I've seen, well, one in particular, I saw this very, how can I put it, right-wing, derogatory, racist website, and it was saying that the two most dangerous people in this country, because they're trying to destroy the fabric of Irish society, and they're both Jews, and there's Ronnie Glenton and yourself.
No, well, I didn't see that.
Yeah,
I must say, I haven't seen that. I do remember when I ran for the European elections back in 2004, some rather nasty graffiti scrawled on my poster saying "Go home to Romania," which was interesting because, of course, my own origin is that my father is Czech, but I have always been an Irish citizen, and my mother is a Murphy from County Clare. So. So, you know, and in fact I was brought up Catholic, although I'm now an atheist, but so I think people get it wrong. I don't think that's that much in a name, frankly. You know, I think there's always going to be a tiny minority for whom the name is an issue, but for most people I don't believe that's the case. And
yet when I come up the stairs and I look at all the auditors of the Law Society, they're pretty much either Irish or Anglo-Saxon.
Well, I mean, I suppose that speaks volumes about the makeup of the Trinity student population. Although I must say we did a diversity walk in Trinity that the Trinity Access Programme ran just a couple of weeks ago, and that was fascinating to see. In fact, the college community has become more diverse, and certainly when I first became a staff member here in the 90s, I set up the law school scholarship scheme to try and have set aside places in law for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, because class is probably the biggest issue in terms of third level population generally in Ireland, that students tend to come from more privileged backgrounds. So we're trying to change that. I think it's happening, but it's happening slowly. And as you say, the past names of the auditors of the Law Society would reflect a very much an Irish and probably a very white and a very middle class sort of demographic. But I think that's changing.
Can I ask you then about, you've spent 5 years in the Senate and you're going again. Many people would say, and the last general election tended to emphasise it to a certain degree, that the Senate is being seen as the consolation prize. In your case, you're going for it because you didn't go for the general election this time around. So can I put it to you, was your decision not to run in the general election, was that strategic?
No, I suppose first of all I've actually been in the Seanad nearly 9 years now. I was first elected in 2007.
Okay, I apologise.
I had run several times before that, of course, but in 2007 I was first elected and then re-elected in 2011, 5 years ago. And I think actually the Seanad has become a much more significant place because of two things. First, because of course the Seanad was endorsed by the people in the referendum held to abolish it, and I opposed the abolition of the Seanad obviously, and campaigned to retain it, and I'm really glad it was retained. But I think the second thing is that the government has not had a majority in the Seanad for the last 5 years, and clearly won't have, whatever the government is unlikely to have any majority in the Seanad this time round. And I think that makes the Seanad a much more interesting and a much more effective place to be in. I've had 3 private members' bills accepted by the government since I've been a senator, and quite a number of other, 3 I should say, that have been accepted by government that are now law, which is a record for any senator, and a number of other bills accepted by the government that I hope to progress if I am re-elected. And I think that that shows that the Seanad can be used in a very particular and effective way as a legislative forum to make legislation. Obviously, it's not the forum from which the government are chosen, but it is all the same a hugely important place in terms of legislation. So no, it wasn't particularly strategic this time. I might have run for the Dáil if there'd been an opening on the Labour ticket for the Dublin Bay South, certainly, but it didn't arise, and I was happy to run for the Seanad.
Can I put it to you then, may you have been more effective in a more democratic chamber?
I think the problem with the Seanad operates in a very democratic fashion once you're in it. The problem with the Seanad, as many of us have said, is that it isn't elected from a hugely democratic constituency. The university senators, ironically, have the biggest constituency. I have nearly 60,000 people entitled to vote in the Trinity Seanad constituency who are the voters for the 3 Trinity seats. There's 100,000 for the NUI seats, the 3 seats elected by the National University of Ireland graduates from UCD and so on. The other 43 senators, of course, elected by county councillors and outgoing senators and incoming TDs. That's not very democratic. And then, of course, there's only about 1,000 people in total elect 43 of the senators, and then 11 are nominated by the Taoiseach. So that's the biggest problem with the Seanad. And certainly I was one of very few sitting senators who made a submission to the working group on Seanad reform that Maurice Manning chaired 2 years ago, looking for the expansion of the electorate for the senators to include all those entitled to vote in the local election register. I think that would make a huge difference to the way in which the Seanad is elected. So it's really, the difficulty lies in who elects senators. Once you're in, the Seanad itself operates in a democratic fashion as a chamber, but the problem lies in who's electing us.
So how do we then go back to the start of what I would call the blueprint for government, which is the Constitution in that sense of the word? Aren't we hamstrung to a huge degree in progressing all those other agendas, and we'll come to those shortly, because of a Constitution that was written some time ago?
1937.
Yes.
Well, in fact, the Constitution does prescribe, for example, that the Taoiseach must have the power to nominate 11 senators, and that 6 senators must be elected by the universities. So we're hamstrung by that. But there are changes that can be made without constitutional amendment. For example, the 43 senators elected on the vocational panels could be elected by a much wider electorate. It could be, for example, by everyone entitled to vote in the local election register. And in fact, the submission that I made to Maurice Manning's group was specifically about what are the changes that you could make to make the Seanad more democratically elected without having to amend the Constitution, because clearly there's no great appetite, I think, among any TDs of any party to have another referendum on Seanad reform. But there's a lot of reforms that could be done without the need to amend the Constitution. The chief one, of course, is to expand the electorate for the 6 university seats to cover graduates of all third level institutions in the state. And that's something, again, I support and have argued for. But I think to do that, you'd also have to amend the electorate, or change the electorate for the 43 senators from the panels, because otherwise it would be very skewed. You'd have 700,000 graduates entitled to elect just 6 senators, and still only 1,000 people, this rotten borough of councillors and TDs and senators, who elect 43. So I think, a more wide sweeping reform, but I hope we'll see it in the lifetime of the next government.
Something, and I don't want to stay too much on the whole issue of political reform, because I gather this is going to be a core part of if we ever get a government. But something I always find embarrassing, I mean, when I was the only one in my house that could vote for a very long time, I know that equality is, I would suggest, a foundation of your political beliefs, but yet somebody who lives in Dublin County Council or Dublin City Council flats 500 metres away can't vote, but somebody who might have been in Trinity for 3 or 4 years and who lives in Timbuktu has no connection to Ireland other than the fact that they came here can. And that seems to me an area that we really need to address, is to grasp the inequality that is there.
Well, in fact, that's really not about the Seanad. That's about inequality and access to third level education. As I say, the Law School Scholarship Scheme, which we started now, nearly 20 years ago when I first came on here as staff, that's expanded across Trinity, and it's the Trinity Access Programme.
Sure, yes.
And there is actually a much greater diversity in terms of students from disadvantaged or working class backgrounds now than there would have been previously. So that, and I think you're seeing that sort of program replicated across the universities. DCU, for example, is an excellent program with the BITE program that they've run for years. So we're seeing access to third level opening up, certainly for people from inner city Dublin, for example, who are very underrepresented at third level. And I would say that, you know, if you look at demographics of third level, you find the children of farmers from rural areas are actually the most likely to go on to third level. So, you know, certainly there's an issue about equality of access, and something I've always campaigned for and actually in practice worked for as well. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, you know, in terms of why should graduates who are living abroad be able to vote? Actually, I think that's a real strength of the university seats. This is the only way in which people who've retained Irish citizenship but have had to move abroad or had to emigrate can still have some sort of say in the National Parliament, is through the Trinity and NUI seats. And it is interesting that we're canvassing voters for Trinity that are living in the Pacific Islands in Australia. I think it's fair enough. They must retain Irish citizenship in order to be entitled to vote. So graduates who, for example, have been gone 30 years and have taken out citizenship in their new adopted country, they no longer are entitled to vote in Trinity or NUI elections. But I think it's fair enough to have diaspora representation in for the university seats, and I think it's a defensible point.
These days, as I get older, I tend to focus more on government and architecture of government than I do on politics. And I go back to when I was studying politics in UCD, my lecturer was the soon-to-be Prime Minister Garrett FitzGerald, and he also used to say about the Senate, well, it's there really to accommodate rich Protestant farmers. Now, and I accept at the time that was valid. But can we not look at, perhaps, instead of doing massive reform, just changing the constituencies, that we can bring in a form of universal franchise? Now, I've canvassed the idea based on what I've seen in New Zealand, for argument's sake, that why not have a religious constituency? Everybody gets to be part of a constituency and you designate. Now, if there was an LGBT constituency, I'd happily say, yeah, that's the one I'll vote in. But I can't see how publicans and auctioneers and all of these other, you know, rich farmers and poor farmers and whatever, get to vote in the Seanad, and my mates who live in Pearse Street don't. And I just really think we need to somehow or other bridge that gap.
Well, first of all, farmers don't have a vote in the Seanad directly.
Well, farmers' representatives do.
Well, yeah, because of the panels, the agriculture. But there's also an industry and commerce panel, there's an arts panel. You know, so there are different panels representing 5 vocational groups. And again, you know, to change that, you need to change the constitution. But what I argued for in my own submission, and what I've argued for consistently in the Seanad, is that you can expand the franchise for the people elected on those panels to cover everyone entitled to vote, for example, in the local elections or in the general elections. So you could have universal franchise for the Seanad without the need for constitutional reform. You'd have to keep the panel structure, but you could easily do that. You could have it, for example, on a regional basis, that everyone there'd be a certain number of Leinster senators on the agriculture panel, a certain number of Leinster senators on the...
But why duplicate on the basis of geography, whereas society is now
you could do it on an... Actually, originally, a group of us made this submission and we put it together. Originally, we had the idea that it would be a national constituency, so you'd just be electing to one panel. But actually, some of the rural senators and Labour particularly felt that it would be important to have some sort of regional thing, or else Dublin would simply dominate. That's the problem, you see. So that it would be better to do it, for example, on the basis of the provinces, and that you'd have regional representation, but you'd still give the right to vote to every Irish citizen resident in Munster or Leinster and so on. So I think it's a really good model, and I hope we'll see that. That could be done through legislation alone. And again, it's something that I hope the next government will bring in, if there is one next government.
Yeah, it will be. Well, probably an administration. No, I was more thinking along the lines of I would like to ensure that there, say, be traveller representation and trans representation, and that we would need to change the constituencies.
Yeah, well, no, you need to change the constitution.
Well, yes,
that's the difficulty. Or else, and I mean, this has been suggested, I think it's a good idea, or else the Taoiseach of the day could commit to having, for example, as the Taoiseach have done in the past, to have a Northern Ireland representative among their 11 nominees. They could say, I'm going to nominate a traveller representative. I think they would be accused of tokenism. I mean, that's one difficulty, but it would certainly be a way of ensuring representation of underrepresented groups. So, you know, I think it would be positive for Taoiseach to do that, but to do it any other way, you'd have to change the constitution.
One of the, although I've had plenty of criticism about the outgoing government, one of the things, and the outgoing Taoiseach, one of the things I have been praiseworthy of is his nominations for the last Seanad, particularly Catherine Sapone and Gillian Van Turnhout. I've said that but after the gender recognition legislation was passed, and most of us are very pleased with that he owed the trans community a representative for 22 years of waiting. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think that, as you say,
there's plenty of excellent.
Enda Kenny
people.
did make actually very good, quite radical actually selection in terms of the Taoiseach nominees. That they were people who were genuinely independent for the most part. You've mentioned Catherine Zappone, first openly gay woman elected to, or member of the Oireachtas, who's now happily in the Dáil, and Gillian Van Turnout, who's has been a super senator. I've worked very closely with Gillian on a whole range of issues around children's rights and so on, and she's been great. Other senators too, who are Fiach McAneill, who really strong spokesperson for the arts, and again very independent. So certainly there were very good Taoiseach nominees chosen. And as you say, very strong LGBT representation in the Seanad, not just Catherine Zappone, but of course David Norris for many years.
Sure.
And indeed in the Dáil, I mean, there's a very strong argument now that in the Dáil we're seeing gay TDs elected. Catherine, in the last election we had quite a number of gay Labour TDs elected. So, I think the need specifically to appoint an LGBT representative as a Taoiseach nominee probably is gone, because I think that particularly with marriage equality having been passed, I think but I think there is a good point about trans people. Certainly, maybe this is the right time to do it now. So now that we have the gender recognition legislation that so many of us fought so hard for a long time. Yep. So there's a strong argument now. We'll see. Yep. We'll see who the incoming Taoiseach is first.
We don't know what the composition of, while we're recording this, we don't actually know what the composition of government is, but whatever it is, I can't see them having repealing the 8th as very high up their agenda. Doesn't that give people like ourselves an incentive to say we need an election again fairly soon?
Well, I'm afraid, yes, like you, I mean, I've been wearing my repeal the 8th badge with great pride. It's an issue on which I've fought and campaigned for decades now. I am absolutely devastated to think that it won't happen in the lifetime of this incoming government, whatever it is, but it certainly looks much less likely. I would say since Labour are not part of this incoming government, the chance of having repeal the 8th referendum is very limited. I'll obviously continue to campaign for it, as will so many of us, but the reality is it clearly wasn't a burning issue for that many voters in the most recent election, and I think that's, the results spoke to that. Should we have another election for that reason? Frankly, I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think we need to be out there making the argument much more strongly about the repeal of the 8th Amendment as a necessary issue. It's not something that impinges on the majority of voters, and I think, as I say, that's reflected in the makeup of this new Dáil, and I don't see that would change hugely. I don't see loads of repeal the 8th candidates being elected if we had another election tomorrow or even in 6 months' time. I think that may take a little longer to bring about. So while the opinion polls that we've seen from Amnesty and from others have in recent years shown clearly a shift towards favouring repeal of the 8th Amendment, I would be wary of thinking for sure that represents a really strong impetus for repeal the 8th. I think it's a bit like the first divorce referendum, which I was too young to vote in, but certainly I remember in the second divorce referendum, which I campaigned in, people were very conscious that a majority can switch, and in the second divorce referendum the majority was tiny. Marriage equality was wonderful, and that was a really different referendum because we got such a strong majority in that, and so many of us had canvassed on that for so long. But marriage equality is a happy story, and I think a referendum on repeal the 8th is a much harder referendum to win, and I think we have to win it. But I think first of all we have to get a majority in the Dáil in favour of calling that referendum. I don't see that happening with the makeup of the current Dáil, nor indeed would I see it happening if there were a new election tomorrow or in 6 months.
You mentioned last year's referendum, and the 22nd of May will always be an immortal day for those of us who are part of that. How did you interpret that? Did you interpret that as this was a referendum not only about LGBT rights but also about the whole issue of equality? Is that was the feeling I came about with, that people actually embrace equality as a philosophy? We might be able to articulate it as clearly as we might wish, but that was the impression I came out with. Do you think that's wishful thinking?
No, I think you're right. I think it was about equality as well as being about LGBT rights. I think it was also a very personal vote. People were very, I think, moved and compelled to vote yes because of the very personal stories. I think there was an excellent campaign run by Yes Equality and civil society groups which really put out there the personal stories and the human side and the need for inclusivity and acceptance and tolerance, all of that. And I think that really was what swung it, was the human side and a desire for equality and this very simple call for equality. So that was really important. But I would say that the referendum would never have happened if Labour hadn't been in government. We did need in the first place a commitment and a programme for government brought about by a party that was pushing on the issue, and Eamon Gilmore and then Joan Burton pushed for that. Fine Gael followed and indeed embraced it then, but it took some years, post the government being elected in 2011, it took then of course 3 or 4 years to bring it round to having the referendum. And I think again that's instructive, that even where you've got a very positive equality message and that ultimately wins out, you still need to persuade first of all a majority of TDs to have that referendum in the first place, and it's not always easy to do. So it's a very strong message of equality, very strong message of inclusivity for LGBT friends and relatives, but it doesn't necessarily translate into any other issue like repeal of the 8th, for example.
Yeah. Because I'm not a member of the Labour Party, I can say Eamon Gilmore probably wasn't given the credit that he was due, because he campaigned for that issue over a very long time, and it was only in the last furlong, as we say, that he wasn't there. How do you feel? Do you think history will be very kind to Eamon Gilmore?
I think it will be probably a lot kinder than the verdict of the voters generally, not just to Eamon but to the Labour Party generally. I mean, marriage equality, people forget now, but in 2011 and 2012 it was still a very much a niche issue. I remember introducing a private member's bill on it in 2012, and people generally being very wary of the issue. People in politics generally, and people in the broader community. I think it was an amazing campaign because it brought people with us. But I do think that Labour's role in instigating it will be recognised more and emphasised more in years to come.
Yep. Something again, going back to this so-called protracted negotiations about government and coalitions and arrangements and all of that. We're hearing a great deal, we must have a minister for the rural areas or the country areas or whatever. We're not hearing much about a minister for equality, and yet that to me would seem to cut across far more interests and areas and boundaries and a whole range of that. Do you think that's a shortcoming of whoever gets into government?
Yes, I'd love to see a full Minister for Equality as we did before, in the 1990s, and full Minister with Mervyn Taylor for Minister for Equality and Law Reform. I didn't like the move of equality and law reform into justice, although I think actually having a junior minister, Aon O'Riordan, in the last government who was junior Minister for Equality, I thought that did work in the end. So, the Minister for Rural Affairs is an interesting one. I imagine that will be part of whatever package is agreed. Personally, I think we need more of a voice for Dublin also. I think if we're looking at that sort of issue, I think a strong voice for Dublin. I've always supported the call for an elected Lord Mayor or elected Mayor of Dublin City, and bring together the 4 local authorities and actually have a collective voice for Dublin. I think the voice for Dublin is weakened by having these 4 local authorities, and nobody really knows where the boundaries of each are, and there's a huge amount of administration in each, and it just seems to me it would be much more sensible to have the old Greater London Authority, the GLC, the Greater London Council, and to have something similar for Dublin.
I'll get myself into trouble with this, but I'm a complete, unashamed regional government for Dublin. I want to be Catalonia.
In fact, we don't have our own language yet, Mike, which
yes, we do.
Give it time.
Come out to the north side, we speak Howlian.
You see, straight away you're bringing in borders, north and south side. It should be a Greater Dublin Council.
I agree with you in that sense, but isn't that a problem really, in the sense that this goes back, Dermot Ferreter, when he did his history of Ireland, or at least his history of Irish government, he basically said the Constitution was written in a way so that Dublin would never become a threat to central authority. Hasn't that haven't we passed that point of there is a certain reality here, is that Dublin has not a preeminence, but it has a size that really is certainly been undermined, particularly in terms of social policy. I mean, Dublin would have accepted LGBT rights a very long time ago, and a whole range of other things.
So interestingly, the marriage equality referendum didn't reflect the urban-rural divide people had anticipated, and there were strong majorities in other areas apart from Dublin too. So that's important, But in terms of the Constitution, no, I don't buy that thesis. The Constitution doesn't provide any obstacle. The Constitution is simply silent on local government altogether. So you could absolutely build in a model of local government, or even the sort of Catalonia model for Dublin, without changing the Constitution. That would be fine. And I think certainly we could move towards it by having some sort of umbrella body that would amalgamate the 4 Dublin councils under one mayor, for example. And I think that would just simply make sense in terms of a transport policy for Greater Dublin, a planning policy. I mean, housing and homelessness, huge issues in Dublin, and we do need to address those in a joined up authority. And we've got some, like we do have Dublin homeless executive, I think it's called, I forget the full title, but so there is a recognition of the need for this, for joined up thinking across Dublin, but you can do that without changing the constitution.
Because your background is law, and I'm not saying that it's exclusively law in the sense that you appreciate the social impacts of law. An area that both of us were involved in for several years, and I think we both were delighted when it was finally passed, was the gender recognition legislation. And I don't think I can praise Kevin Humphreys enough on that. He grasped the nettle on that.
Sure.
We agree that it's great compared to what was originally proposed. There's still a way to go in terms of people under 18. Is that something that you see as being important and having a certain priority in the new Senate coming in?
Yes, I think it will be. I think there were people like Gillian Van Turnout who really pushed the issue of recognition for children and mechanisms for children to achieve recognition. I'm really glad that in fact it's 16 rather than 18, that there is a mechanism for children at 16. I think that we need to see how that mechanism beds down, and certainly there's a commitment now. This was an important concession Kevin Humphreys got, was that we'd have a review of the legislation in a couple of years after it comes into effect. I think that's going to be really important. So I hope in the Seanad we'll certainly drive that review and help to ensure that the review brings about more progressive change where necessary in the legislation. But generally it is a very progressive piece of legislation. I mean, by European standards it's way ahead. And the moving away from the medicalisation model that was originally proposed was really positive too. So no, I think in general it was a great exercise in legislative process, because as the bill went through both houses and then back to the Seanad, started in the Seanad, then the Dáil, the Seanad, it changed and improved all the way.
Sure. Because you're running for one of the college constituencies, or one of the panels is what they're called. How important do you see access to education? You've alluded to it earlier. How important do you see that, particularly in terms of minority groups being represented by their own? Because my understanding is that I think there's one traveller barrister, one traveller lawyer, there's no traveller doctors, and so on and so forth. And Trinity, as you say, has had the access programme, and that's been very well received and very well commended. But there's an awful lot of people out there that could benefit from it, and I'm just wondering how you feel that becomes a priority for your campaign.
Well, it's always been a priority. Every time I've run in any campaign, and indeed before I was ever campaigning, it was a priority. And the Trinity Access Programme, I'm really proud of the role of the law school, and we had to play by setting up the scholarship scheme in the first place. We fundraised from our own graduates privately. We did our own set aside places in law before it was ever adopted across the college. So it was hugely, I think it was a hugely important programme, and we learned from other programmes like BITE and DCU and so on. So I think that's something that's just going to grow and grow. And in particular, actually, people who coming back to second chance education. Before I taught in Trinity, I taught in the National College of Industrial Relations, which is a college actually that's always had a strong commitment to second chance. We had a much bigger number of mature students than of school leavers on our programmes there, and I thought it was a really great atmosphere, really great environment then for learning. So I think we're going to see that changing as well as issues around disadvantage and economic background. We're going to see people from a much more diverse range of ages coming to third level. I think that's going to be a hugely positive change. And I should say, on equality of access, it's not just about third level. I've campaigned for a long time with Educate Together for more inclusive schooling at primary and secondary level, and in particular to ensure that children of particular religions aren't prioritised or privileged. And I was the founder member of a group that set up a new multi-denominational school in Dublin 8 in my own area. It's a great school, it's thriving, Canalway Educate Together, and it's the first school in Ireland to have transformed from a Catholic school into a multi-denominational school, because the school is housed in an old Christian Brothers building on Basin Lane in Rialto. And it's been really, really positive experience and a great campaign to see so many parents standing behind us in seeking multi-denominational education for their children, to ensure that their children wouldn't be disadvantaged because they're not of a particular religion. So I'm continuing to work with Educate Together for secondary in Dublin South Inner City. There's a new North Side Dublin multi-denominational school being opened this September under the joint patronage of the old VEC, the Education Training Board, and Educate Together in Clonshock. So that's going to be really great. And I think we'll soon see, I hope in 2018, a new secondary open in the similar model, or an Educate Together model in Dublin South. So this is a really growing movement of
It
parents.
is, yes,
Unite
yes,
small children. It's a huge issue for all of us.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think everybody in our position, you get to address that when your kids get to a certain age.
Absolutely, it suddenly becomes pressing, you know. So it was as I say, we ran a really big campaign in our local area in Dublin 8 for this school. It's great to see it thriving, but parents shouldn't have to fight for years to get a multi-denominational school. We should be moving much more generally to a system of multi-denominational school.
Yeah. Well, they are called national schools. I mean, not
exactly.
We won't go.
But it's great to see actually new campaigns like Equate and Education Equality being set up now in the last year, looking for repeal of the provision in the Equal Status Act that allows schools to discriminate on the basis of religion. So I think it's becoming a much bigger issue, and it was coming up on doorsteps in the general election campaign too.
Yeah. I'm going to finish off with the controversial issue because we couldn't do it all and agree on everything.
Sure.
The one issue that I think I'm having difficulty with some of the people who I'm very close to, and that is the issue of what we will call, for want of a better term, sex workers' rights. Do you believe that there is such a thing as sex workers' rights, or do you just see it from the exploited position?
Yes, I do. I think that, of course, there must be rights for those engaged in prostitution, both women and men. Although I think we would all agree that the vast majority of those engaged in prostitution are women, and the vast majority of the clients or buyers of sex are men. And my own position has changed. I would have been much more, much more inclined to see it as work and to suggest and to think that perhaps there might be a way of legalising it without legalising prostitution while addressing exploitation. Over years, I suppose, and particularly working as a criminal defence barrister and representing women on the front line, working, who were working as prostitutes and were being processed through the courts and fined and back out in the streets again to pay the fine, seeing the reality of exploitation and living in a red light district on a street where women were on a nightly basis being picked up by men, mostly in big cars. I think my view has changed because of that reality, and I suppose also because prostitution has changed in Dublin. It's changed. We're seeing much fewer Irish women engaged in it, much more women who are being brought into the country, trafficked in or brought in other ways, and who are from very poor countries where they really don't see much of a choice in terms of the prostitution is what they have to do in order to stay in Ireland and so on. So I think that things have changed, and I've worked with the Immigrant Council now with Turn Off the Red Light in Ruhama and so on for some years on this issue. And I've travelled to Sweden as part of an Oireachtas Justice Committee delegation, and I've spoken with people from Amsterdam, from Sweden, from New Zealand, looking at all the different models, and come down to the view that the best model for Ireland to adopt is based upon the Swedish model, which is that you decriminalise the women or men engaged in prostitution, the actual sellers of sex. You decriminalise, you're recognising their rights, and you're decriminalising, you're recognising that they are people who shouldn't be prosecuted and criminalised. And I strongly believe that. It's absolutely pointless. Our current law is the worst of both worlds. We criminalise the seller and the buyer, but not for selling or buying, not for the contract. Rather, we criminalise for the loitering and the soliciting and the public manifestation of prostitution or the organisation of it in private. So that law we currently have dates back to 93, has to be changed one way or the other, and I think most people agree on that. And I want to see us change it to the Swedish model, where we decriminalise the sellers, so we're removing them from the criminal justice system, and we criminalise instead the buyer, and that the purchase of sex becomes the criminal offence. And that's the Swedish model. It's a minor offence. It carries only a minor penalty, but the point is it targets for the first time the demand side rather than supply. And in that way, you seek to reduce and minimise the exploitation involved in prostitution, and you seek to reduce the numbers of women who feel that they have no choice but to work in prostitution. So to me, that makes sense, and we've seen it work in Sweden. We've been convinced by the evidence. I should say we held numerous hearings on the Justice Committee. We produced a very carefully worded report and recommending the change, and as a result of that, Minister Francis FitzGerald did bring in, as you know, the Sex Offences Bill. It went through the Seanad and was passed in the Seanad after much debate, and is now just finished second stage in the Dáil, and I'm hoping it will be revived by the incoming government and passed, because I would like to see us try this model out. The current model doesn't work. We're seeing immense exploitation. The Immigrant Council is very clear about that. Immense exploitation of those who are sex workers or who are engaged in the sale of sex, and there's no protection for them because they are criminalised. The guards have to pursue them. That doesn't work. We need to move away from that model.
Yeah. No, the issue, a couple of points on that. One, my experience of sex workers, and I use the term sex workers rather than prostitution, is in Australia. Very different from the Swedish model. which tends to be more focused on the worker rather than the environment. But the bit that strikes me as being extremely unequal in this proposal is that I've got two friends, both are wheelchair bound, both males, and both have openly admitted, not easy, that they have paid for sex. And they're basically being told, no, that's okay, but do it in Amsterdam. That seems to me the Eighth Amendment in a different variation.
Well, we heard from disability rights activists how annoyed they were to see, you know, that being put forward as an excuse, as in, you know, it's not exploitation where people have disability. To me, that doesn't make sense.
No, but I've never come across a trafficked sex worker. I'm not saying they don't exist. I have never come across one. And what I'm saying
you need to
is
talk
that,
to people in the immigrant centre and immigrant
well,
council.
what I'm saying is that those women that work the streets,
Yeah.
the rule of
Just
thumb
walk
is that
down.
90% of them are substance abusers. That in other words, you deal with the substance, then you deal with the issue. In other words, that if these women were able to get their heroin or wherever it is in a safe way, they wouldn't be out there.
If you don't mind me saying, like, it's a bit dated now. Like when we lived in Herbert Place in the early 90s, that was certainly the case. Young Irish women, substance abusers, mostly opiate users, the women I would have defended and represented in court.
Sure.
Yes, that has changed, and the profile of those engaged in prostitution now has changed, and I think that's well documented. And it is much more likely now to be migrant women.
Sure.
Substance abuse is not the primary issue.
Poverty is that right?
And migration is the primary issue. And I think that's what distinguishes, and if you don't mind me saying, people who say sex worker like it's a sort of a badge of honour, I think let's be careful about this. This is not work as we understand work in other settings. This is a very different sort of work. Certainly there's borderlines. I had friends in London who worked in the sex industry, but they weren't selling sexual intercourse. They were doing escorting. So clearly there's a shady line. Yeah. But I think it stops being work if people are coerced, if they're trafficked, if they're forced. And the problem with prostitution is the level of exploitation is so high in the day-to-day or night-to-night business of it. It's very hard to say there's only those women who are trafficked in. There should only be penalties for those who have engaged in intercourse with them, which is the British model, for example. You know, it's very difficult, just from a criminal law point of view, very difficult to prove knowingly that anyone knowingly has had sex with a trafficked person. You know, if one recognises the exploitation involved in the act, the contract, then I think it's easier to say, well, this is not work as we know work, this is coerced labour. Certainly there are people engaged in the softer side of the sex industry who have chosen to enter it. You know, as I say, my friends in London had choices. I think the difference is where you don't have the choice.
That's coming back to poverty though, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yep. Ivana, I won't hold you up any longer. The Senate, 24th, you're asking people to get out there, get their votes in.
Absolutely, by the 26th, 11 a.m, Tuesday 26th of April. That's D-Day.
And final word on it, if we have an election in 6 months, might you be a candidate in that?
I'd say I'll stick with the Seanad for the time being, Mike. I think that there's enough to be doing in there, you know. We'll see if we can get repeal of the 8th back on the agenda.
Well, look, at least if we get you back into the Seanad, there'll be some quality there again.
Thank you very much.
We wish you the very best.
Thank you.
World that I want to have a little pride in, my world, and it's not a place I have to hide in. Life's not worth a damn till you can say I am what I